Hello, welcome to today's Expert Talks Online. My name is Lindsay Brewer. I'm a delivery lead with Equal Experts. I'm your host for today's session. Today's event is very special for many reasons, starting with it being part of this year's Leeds Digital Festival. And we welcome attendees joining us by this exciting two-week festival. This is the third year we've taken part. So normally we're in the Leeds City Centre, unfortunately we can't be there today. Whilst people are joining, I thought it'd be good to chat about recent security news. The thing I came across this week, which was of interest, was a very interesting blog post about what can happen if you post your flight boarding pass on Instagram. Did other people see that story? What are other people's views on the dangers of posting that kind of thing and problems with the airline industry's booking systems?
I mean, I love a good barcode on Instagram. I think it's a good fun, similar to people who post pictures of their brand new credit card or debit card. Equally good fun. I guess the bit for me is it's a barcode, right? It's not meant for the customer, it's meant for the airline. And so there's a real question of whether they're being I guess reasonable in their approach to their own customers and printing that on there. Are they giving them the best opportunity to protect their own data? Because they know for sure that we're all going to take photos and post them online, right?
In fact, don't we normally take a screenshot so that we can more easily check in with our phones? And then it's really easy just to say, share it to Twitter or Instagram or whatever you're going to do. Hey, look where I'm going. Cool.
Yeah, here's my date of birth and home address.
Yes. Oh, wait, there's a whole bunch of data in that. I didn't know that.
I suspect it's also quite telling how hard it is to solve some of these problems when you've got a system that's spread across so many companies across the globe. Trying to make a change like that is probably quite an undertaking. It just reinforces how important it is to make sure you get these things right as best you can early on, because decisions can be very hard to reverse further down the line.
That is very true, Stuart. And one of the things that I think is important to think about with this story is that all of the information that you need to access the account is on the boarding pass. And there is the question that you raised, but also most of us now buy our tickets online via some system, Travelocity, Skyscanner, the airline's own website. Well, whoever's buying airline tickets anyway. We set up an account. We have a username and password. There's a credit card associated with it. It's easy to conceive of a system that says, don't let this user in if they're not logged into the system that they use to buy the account, or to say, let's require the last 4 digits of the credit card number that was used to buy the ticket as part of an authentication scheme. That the problem here is that the airlines moved from a system where they had no authentication because there was no online access to these systems to an online system, and they never really sat down to think about the threats to that system.
Yeah, I think particularly with the advent of things like Instagram and people sharing much more readily and perhaps without thinking how that information might be shared.
Sounded like you were doing a good intro for threat modeling there, Adam.
Who, me?
So unlike you, yeah.
Teeing up Grant.
Great, let's use that intro to kick off officially now. We've got about 34 people joining us. So welcome again. It's great to have you on today's session. Again, it's a very special session today for a few different reasons. As I said, it's part of this year's Leeds Digital Festival, so we welcome people joining us as part of that festival. Today is also a special session that it's continuing our series on security. And finally, we have a much larger and more diverse panel today for our Fishbowl. So I'm looking forward to some really interesting questions and conversations after Grant's talk. Tonight, we're going to be exploring how to do security architecture and threat modeling as part of development planning. And we're going to be learning about the gamification of threat modeling using OWASP Cornucopia. We're really excited and grateful to have Grant Ongers, one of the security consultants, presenting this evening. I apologize, Grant, if I mispronounced your surname. Following his talk, he's going to be joined by quite a range of other people for the Fishbowl discussion. If you've not joined us before, to do the Fishbowl, we'll be using Zoom's Q&A widget to drive the questions. So if during the talk you have questions, please pop them in using the Q&A function, and then vote for ones that you'd like to see answered first. We'd also welcome people from the audience to join the Fishbowl panel. If you've got something to contribute to the discussion or want to field some of the questions other people are asking, please use the Zoom raise hand feature, and then Steve, our person that's lurking in the background, will help you onto the panel. Okay, I'll now hand over to Grant. So take it away, Grant.
Hey, folks. So yeah, the title of the talk is Gamification of Threat Modeling using OWASP Cornucopia. But as you see, we'll get into a bunch of things. And I think the most interesting part is going to be when we start talking about it at the end of the session. So first off, who I am. There's a lot of information on that slide, not quite as much as would be on my boarding pass. But what you can take away from that is how to get hold of me. Grant@securedelivery.io if you're looking for something commercial. Grant@ongers@owasp.org if it's related to the foundation in some way, or at Roots, Demon, REWTD, everywhere else. The other thing you can take away is that I'm really, really involved in the community. I think that the community, the security community, is probably my home away from home. The other thing you can take away is I've done this for a long time, far too long, as you can see by the gray in my beard. And yeah, let's dive straight into it. A little bit about the foundation. Started in 2001, December 1st, so we are 20 years old next year. There are more than 150 projects that change the world, including things like the OWASP Top 10, which everybody's ever heard of, and OWASP Zap, a bunch of other ones that are really popular. And there are about 280 chapters, more or less, worldwide. And they are all about community. We also run 2 or 3 conferences a year. Currently, they're very much virtual, but I do enjoy the in-person events. And I hope to meet some of you guys at those future events. A little bit about secure delivery. We help quantify the value of both security and delivery. We work with companies like Equal Experts to do that with their customers. And we help management understand the value of security, and also understand, from the security side, understand what delivery is all about. Hopefully we can help them make things better. On to threat modeling. So we're going to go through what I mean by threat modeling, because it does require a little bit of definition for the purposes of what I'm talking about. We're going to look at what that looks like at pace. We're going to talk about Cornucopia and why I care about it and why I think it's awesome. And then we'll talk about some practical things. So first and foremost, you can't talk about threat modeling without briefly talking about Stride. And I'm going to do it very briefly, because I've heard 100 talks where somebody runs through the spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, alienation privilege, and Adam does it far better than I do. He's probably had to use that mnemonic 100 times. Stride is 21 years old this year. Last year, Adam did a write-up for its 20th birthday. That write-up is available on Dark Reading. There is a URL that will get you there. It is still incredibly valuable. Stride still has a place in the world of threat modeling today. However, where were we 21 years ago? Well, 21 years ago, we all did delivery that looked a little bit like this. It's a linear process, waterfall, and I haven't done the nice stepping down things, mainly because I'm pretty sure that should be a copyrighted image by now. But it starts with requirements, and you then move on till deployment. And you really only get one chance right here to get an idea of the threats that you're going to be facing, the threats that you're going to be dealing with. And some industries still do waterfall. It's not over, it hasn't disappeared. Some places it's required because you're building things for hardware. The problem is that if you miss something from a threat perspective at this point, you're fixing it in production. Agile, far more linear. this wonderful 8. I can't do a presentation ever really without showing this. But we only get a chance to really change things here. But it's a very short release, very small amount of work. So we get to refine it each time. And we can do that with information that we pick up here, and well, actually here, really, let's be honest. That's the whole point of Agile. So with threat modeling and Agile, we design for security, usually in the design phases. But this takes time. And the larger the piece of functionality that we need to look at, the more time it's going to take. And as our product evolves, so must our security understanding of that product. And if it doesn't, we're in trouble. I believe that this leads to a number of issues. Those issues are, we end up modeling too late. When do we, security folks, actually get our hands on designs? Is it before coding has actually started? Not usually. And if it is, how much is it going to change? And are we usually the ones holding up delivery? That's pretty much always the case. According to Stephen and Avi of the OWASP Threat Modeling Project, on when threat modeling should ideally happen, it's the sooner the better, but never too late. Of course, that doesn't actually tell us anything we didn't already know. It does lead to more trouble, though. How much time is enough time? And I'm definitely going to hear it for this next quote. This quote, you probably want to find too many threats rather than too few, is one that Adam posted on his blog on magical approaches to threat modeling. And in it, he asks for a fourth option to the 3 magical approaches that he lists, and ones that don't result in too many threats. Now, hopefully we can oblige a little bit this evening, and we can talk about that. But the question I have is, when do we stop looking for threats? And this is a great question for him later. Inaccurate models. Are our threat models good enough? Well, George Box says, all models are wrong, some are useful. And this is, of course, a very famous quote. The question is the model good enough for the particular application? So we only have to have a model that is good enough. So a good enough model that we need to build using the time we can afford and as early as possible in the process. Perfect. So the earliest place we can do that is during story scrubbing or backlog grooming. Mike Cohen coined the phrase backlog grooming in 2005. Whatever you want to call it, it's before stories are added to a sprint, before they start getting worked on. It's where you start defining the acceptance criteria of what we want to build. Backlog grooming happens anyway. It's time boxed. So we're already using the time we have available. And we already expect NFR outcomes from that process, so it fits right there. So we stop when we're just about close enough. When we can build the thing we need to, when we have enough to fulfill the acceptance criteria. Remember, we're iterating, right? So we can come back and we can do more later. That brings me to Cornucopia. It's a game built on a number of very well thought through projects like the SVS, like the SCP, and App Sensor from OWASP. It's built on safe code, and it references MITRE's common attack pattern enumeration and classification. There are other games out there, and we will probably at least touch on elevation of privilege at some point. EOP is also gamification threat modeling, but I feel that Cornucopia more focuses on developers and the way that developers look at the problem, rather than the way that we as security folks look at it. So, what do you need to do to start playing Cornucopia? Well, we start off with architectural diagrams, data flow diagrams, but don't get too hung up on those. Mainly, we want some time to play, as many folks building or testing the features that we're going to be producing as we can get, and a will to do it. Outputs, well, traditional threat modeling gets you a rigorous model with possible threats, gets you some great insights into the diagram state of your application and into the data flow as it's anticipated. I really like this template, which is actually from the OWASP Threat Modeling Cookbook, which Tash, I believe, is co-lead on. With Agile threat modeling, though, we want to improve existing stories with some security acceptance criteria, some NFRs. We want to put security in the context of the function of the application, the functional part of our code, And probably we want to maintain those diagrams that we started off with. We'll find that they will change as we actually start playing with them. Threat modeling can't be academic. It can't just be something we come up with and then we put into a file somewhere. It must actually change the system in order for it to be useful. How do we identify issues and get them on the backlog and then get product owner sponsorship so the stuff actually gets fixed? Well, this is the way that we do it. We use a deck of cards, Cornucopia. The deck contains authentication, which is about who you are, kind of maps to spoofing and repudiation of Stride. It contains authorization, which is about what you can do, and it maps to Stride's elevation of privilege, right? Really the holy grail of attacking an application. It contains cards about session management, which is basically how often do we deal with authorization and authentication, and it helps us to solve some of the problems around denial of service. It contains data validation cards, which is, well, data validation and encoding, which is all about trust boundaries, and that really helps us to deal with things like tampering. It contains cryptography, which combats information disclosure, wrapping back to Stride. And those are kind of the OWASP top 5. Not actually a thing, but what about that last suit? I said there were 6. That last suit is the Cornucopia suit, and it's a Trump suit that literally covers all of the things. The game itself is a 9-step process. Starting by pre-sorting, going through the deck to decide which cards you want to play. You can play them all, but it will take more time. Deal the cards out, play the cards, describe the cards, convince the people you're playing with that your attack is one that will work. Do some scoring, and then the next person plays. And at the end, you have to award someone who's won because somebody will end up with the right number of points. There should be a prize for that. There should be, it's a game after all, right? And then you follow up. Each item needs to be added to the backlog. I don't know if this is going to work, and if it does, great. If it doesn't, we'll see later. I don't know if you guys can hear any audio on that.
No, we can't at the moment.
Okay, I will post this. This is a 15-minute video that covers, well, it's less than 15 minutes, and it covers the whole game with some examples. And you can see that things have changed massively for me during lockdown, in that I have successfully avoided my razor even further. But the company that put that together is a company called RBI, and I'm going to do a quick shout out to them here now. They have massive scale, 1,500 developers. I mean, I've worked with larger organizations than that, but 1,500 developers is far too many people that I can train in person. They have some hard problems to solve. Most of them are data related. Portions of their business provide transaction filtering for some of the, well, most of the world's top 10 banks worldwide. That means it's high volume, very data driven, incredibly sensitive data. And a lot of it is tied, the data is tied to how the thing functions. So developers need to understand what that data looks like in order to build for it. They're also built out of a bunch of smaller businesses, and they've expanded by acquiring smaller businesses. And they don't want to lose that agile mindset, that agility that comes with having a small group of people who know what they're doing. So why do we do these things? Well, we do Cornucopia over other threat modeling, mainly because we have devs do it. Right? Traditional threat modeling happens in security teams or is heavily supported by security teams. And security teams often don't have developers in them. And they definitely don't have the developers in them who are going to implement the code that we care about for the particular application we're looking at. It's educational. Devs learn from it, not only about threats, not only about the security concerns, but we've actually used Cornucopia to help teams onboard other new members, because when you discuss the potential flaws in the system, you have to discuss the architecture to some degree and give everyone on the team a pretty good understanding of what's going on. We found it to be very effective because things actually get looked at. Combine some of the competitive nature that developers have with practical and a developer-aligned view on the types of security issues we're dealing with. Added to the fact that it's part of story scrubbing, it's part of what they're already doing, and it becomes very effective. It's also addictive. Maybe addictive is the wrong word, but we have noticed that devs tend to want to play, and they also start seeing the world through that security lens that we're trying to give them. So the quote, the full quote from Jeff Jenkins, who's the CISO at RBI Business, is threat modeling with Cornucopia empowers engineers to expand their application security knowledge through thought-provoking challenges, which in turn allow them to move fast, more securely. Jeff has one of the hardest jobs, being a CISO of an organization that's really large, that is running in regulated environments, and that is built up of tiny teams that are used to doing whatever they want, whenever they want it. He knows that the business's ability to move quickly is important, but he wants it to be done securely. And the best way to do that is to have the developers actually learn how to do it. So how do we make it work? Well, you have to use the decks, not simply by dealing down through them. We had a couple of teams who tried to do that. You can check the checkbox. We went through the deck of cards. It doesn't actually work. Going through the deck of cards in that way is as effective as a security person looking at the application from the outside. You have to change up the game a little bit. Not all features need to be modeled, and that's possibly a topic for discussion just now. Use the systems that are available. You're communicating as a team. Right now, we can't sit down in person. We don't have a whiteboard that we can scribble on. This is something that Adam and I have talked about, how threat modeling and whiteboarding is, they go hand in hand. But there are tools that we're using. There's actually a company called Agile Stationery. They can sell and ship you decks. There's a discounted rate if you're an OWASP member. And if you're not an OWASP member, but you're buying in bulk, they'll give you a discount on that as well. I'll have some links at the end that you guys can make notes of. Or you can get the decks through Secure Delivery or through Equal Experts. I've got a PR in for the Cornucopia page, which lists those two additionals. There's also decks of cards from a previous version of Cornucopia that were made available through a company called Blackfoot, and I think they're still doing that. So something else that you need to know about is Agile Stationery have this thing called the Cropier, or however it's pronounced. Hopefully somebody knows how it's pronounced. But essentially it's a card dealing application that you pick the deck, whether it's EOP or it's a Cornucopia that you're wanting to distribute cards to. You list the names of the people that are playing, and it will assign cards to those individuals. And you just send it off to them so they know which cards they have in their hand. It does make physical hand cards possible remotely over the internet. That's kind of cool in that way. So, I don't know if there's any other questions. I said I had some links for you. So the RBI Video Walk-Through link is that YouTube link there. Feel free to grab it. The 20 Years of Stride article that Adam wrote, there's a short URL for that. Cheat sheets, if you're looking for other threat modeling information from OWASP, or the threat modeling cookbook, which is one of Tash's projects, or if you're looking for the cards themselves. And if you're an OWASP member, use OWASP 20. If you're not an OWASP member, you could still use OWASP 20, I'm sure. They won't mind. And don't forget the croupier, because it does allow the Scrum Master, saves them a little bit of time. And that's me.
Great, thank you very much, Grant. That was a really interesting presentation. I was just having a quick look now at the Agile Croupier tool, which looks really awesome. So we're going to move now into the Fishbowl discussion. So Grant, you can probably stop sharing your screen now, I think. If you're, you just click on stop sharing. Click on the share screen button at the very bottom of your screen.
Except that what I have is a list of people who are.
Okay, we'll just perhaps leave your screen up for the moment. So yeah, whilst people are putting questions in, if we could have the panel introduce themselves, please just give a little bit of information about themselves, so people, the participants, understand your background, your interest in security. Okay, thanks. If you, Adam, do you want to go first, and do you want to nominate someone to introduce themselves next?
Sure. So I'm Adam Shostak. I created Elevation of Privilege, which Grant mentioned, wrote a book on threat modeling, and so have been engaged with this for a long time. And maybe I'll call on Tash to go next.
Hi everyone, my name's Tash. My background is financial services and then e-commerce and security architecture. And I'm a head of security now, which means that in theory I should do loads of admin, but most of the time I do engineering stuff because it's way more fun. I did help kick off the threat modeling cookbook project because I found that there were so few great examples outside of Adam's book. And that's something that I'm still really keen and passionate about, is helping to make threat modeling a little bit more accessible. I'm going to hand it over to Stuart.
Thanks, Tash. Hi, I'm Stuart Gunter. I'm Security Practice Lead at Equal Experts. My background is software engineering, so I came through the roots of software development in .NET, Java, various other bits and bobs along the way, and always had an interest in security, which is where it led me to a full-time position in security. And now I head up the practice at Equal Experts, doing what I really enjoy. My interest in threat modeling very much goes back right to the beginning. I read Adam's book. That was probably my sort of wake-up moment to the idea, and I still reference the 4 great questions, and I think chapter 1 of what threat modeling actually is, that is my go-to definition. So it's great to be on a panel with you, Adam. And I will hand over to Nina.
Thank you. I am Nina Ali. I am the Executive Director of the Biohacking Village at DEF CON. I have worked in healthcare for about 16 years, building and breaking electronic medical records and the associated IoT devices. And I'm handing it back to Lindsay.
Great. Okay, thanks for your intros, folks. Right, so if the audience could start voting for some of the questions, and thank you for the questions that have come in so far. I've stuck a vote on the top one, so currently we'll start working through them in vote order. So Simon Gibbs is asking, how much effort do you spend on convincing during a gaming session? So that was convincing that your threat is going to succeed, I think. Is that right, Grant?
That probably is what he means. I'm guessing that it depends very much on how argumentative the rest of the group is and how good you are presenting your argument. I've seen discussions that go on for 15 minutes about a single card. But on the other hand, there are cards where somebody plays it and everybody goes, "Ah, yes, of course." And there's no discussion at all. They just write it down and they already know what they're supposed to be doing to fix it.
I think also it's worth, so go ahead, Adam.
One of the things that led me to create Elevation of Privilege was the importance of having conversations. When you have a very stilted, very checklist-driven approach to threat modeling, there's no conversation. There's no opportunity for the developers to ask questions and engage. And the reason that we put energy into making these look like a game is so that people would get into a game mindset. Their backs don't go up. They're not as defensive. And so it's really an opportunity to educate and have a conversation. And so taking advantage of that and the convincing, this can happen, this is real, this is worth fixing, understanding the objection, you're never going to have a better time than when people are having fun and talking to you.
And I think also something I've experienced is sometimes those sorts of conversations where the convincing takes a long time, it's because people are very convinced of their own understanding of the system, and that forces you to reevaluate how well you really know what you're building. If 2 people working on the same team have such strong differing opinions of how the system works, then the outcome, if you don't reach agreement during the session, the outcome is likely that each of those people is going to go away and research further to either prove they're right or confirm that they're wrong. And that can only be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Anyone else want to contribute, or should we move on to the next question? Okay,
I'm going to have the most controversial comment here. Sorry. So coming from the healthcare environment, whenever I work on something, it's, well, what if that's not the case? So what if we try this instead of that and just see what happens? And like Stuart said, it's let's just see what happens. Let's see it play out. And if we're wrong, but now we know why we're wrong. And because it's security and because it's development, so much of it is in real time and healthcare is in real time. It just perpetuates itself to see who wins or however the game ends.
When you're playing it out, are you having engineers actually kind of step through the attack with the software to really test it out? Or are they just doing it based on their knowledge of the system? Yeah.
As far as healthcare is concerned, the problem with healthcare is that there's not a lot of security folks to have the conversations with the developers while they're developing medical devices. That comes in as a last option of just bolt it on, everything's going to be great. So what a lot of teams are starting to do is rotating people in and out so that the conversations can progress. And if there's a question, they have people that they can have face-to-face conversations with, things like that.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so let's move on to another question, shall we? So next highest most voted one was one from the panel before we started the talk. Is there a size of change that threat modeling works best for? And this came from myself. So I was thinking, if my team is working on a very small feature or they're just doing a change to an existing process, is threat modeling considered overkill in certain situations, or is there something more appropriate for small changes?
I think that's a really good question. Sorry, I'll jump in here. I think it's a really good question because the problem with threat modeling writ large is it feels like a lot of work. And there are some things that really aren't necessarily going to be problematic, or if they are, the work and effort in exploiting them is so great that it's really not worth looking at too much effort to counter. I really, and look, I have versions of the EOP deck myself, and I love using it, and it works really well. But the thing I enjoy most about Cornucopia is that it looks at the threats from a developer perspective, and with that list of the 5 that I talk about, if we're hitting one of those 5 areas, we know we need to talk about it, right? It's one of those 5 areas is going to be a question about doing threat modeling. If it's not hitting those 5 areas, maybe not. I'm sure there will be some conflicting views.
Stuart mentioned the 4 questions, which are: what are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? Did we do a good job? And we can ask, that's not heavyweight. That's not big. That's not complicated. I like to threat model every single feature. And for some feature, the answer is what we're working on is really small. None of these 5 things in Cornucopia can go wrong. We're done. Right? That is a threat modeling exercise. And so when we get to, like, is there a size of change? You can and should be asking those questions all the time.
The one thing I'd love to add to that is you don't have to involve your entire security team every time you do a threat model, right? If we're utilizing tools like Cornucopia, the 4 questions, elevation of privilege, or even the OWASP cheat sheets, which are really good, there's no harm in a 3 amigo style approach. If your engineers are doing pair programming already, they can hold each other accountable for asking those questions. The only thing I would challenge on a small change is just because your change is small doesn't mean that the change in your wider environment isn't. And so I'd often prompt teams to think about whether the environment they're deploying to or their risk appetite has also changed, and in which case that might call for a slightly bigger threat model.
Yeah, I think Tash has really nailed it there with the challenge on the size of change. A similar example on the other end of the sort of the process that I've seen is with penetration testing, where there's a requirement that you have it done on a time basis or when there's a significant change. And there's this ongoing debate of what's a significant change. But if you're working in continuous delivery, every change is small, and lots of small changes accumulate to be big. So if we look for ways to say, how can we not do it, then it feels like we're avoiding dealing with the problem properly. And I think Adam's point about the exercise potentially being very, very quick, if you can't find anything that could go wrong with that change, that's still a threat modeling exercise. Our mindset needs to change. It's not necessarily a big onerous process that we're going through. And if we've made it that, then we need to revisit that.
Great. Okay, thanks for those responses. We're getting plenty more questions coming, so let's move on to another one now. So the next question is that threat modeling is not a checklist, but sometimes the AppSec dev ratio is so big that you need to automate some things. What is the middle ground to scale? I want to try and tackle that question.
I think there's a lot in that question. Look, coming from the dev side, you want to automate everything, right? Everything you can automate, you should. If you can't automate it, it's because a human being needs to be involved, the brain needs to be engaged. Threat modeling is about engaging those brains. So I think the way you scale threat modeling is essentially what Adam, Nina, and Tash were talking about. You have the developers do it, right? The people who write the code are thinking the way they should be thinking about the problems they should be thinking about. And sometimes that will require them to do things manually, but there are 100 times more devs than there are security people in almost every organization, right? The ratio is 100 devs, 10 architects, 1 security person. So you scale it by having devs do it. And some things can be automated. I think threat modeling is not one of them. I really believe that threat modeling is about thinking about the way humans, hackers, would break a system, the way the system is fit together.
For anyone that might have heard me talk previously, I talk about engineers being my extended pyramid scheme. So pretty much what Grant's saying, you pass on that knowledge. The one thing I guess I would challenge on the automation of threat modeling is that, yes, it's a creative approach, and so you always need that human element. However, once you capture a threat, there's no reason why you can't write a test to validate the fix. And if you're writing a test to validate the fix, there's probably a chance you can write an automated test to check for the bug itself. And so what I do prompt our engineering teams is that those tests are by no means a replacement for threat models, but they do become almost like a threat library or prompts for you to run for anything that you produce to validate. Yeah.
Thanks, those are great answers. I'm kind of replaying this in my head for something I'm working on right now, so they're super relevant. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to a new question. So one from the panel was, can you share any war stories of challenging situations when engineering teams were not receptive to threat modeling? How did you handle that? Who would like to tackle this one first?
I will. I have stats, so I can prepare to all meetings. There's about 3 pages of stats in here. So recently got this book, The Foreword of Medical Device Cybersecurity for Engineers and Manufacturers, some statistics on it within the first 3 paragraphs. The US has 6,000 hospitals, 3 to 6 networked medical devices per bed in the hospitals, which equals a total of 931,203 staffed beds, which is approximately 3 to 6 million connected medical devices, and non-medical devices also include elevators, HVACs, electricity, which now means that just in the hospital, in the hospitals of the US, there's 10 to 15 million total connected devices. So the war story I carry on this is that all things medical are as old as time, and people don't really want to have that change. Medical technology became electronic about 16, 17, 18 years ago, so it's still relatively new. It's still crawling. So the war story I carry with this is I gave a talk once, and the hard eye roll was because of the conclusion of this. I was talking to the human about his medical device, and he gave me information, and I said, well, if it's not a connected device, how are you getting information from point A to point B? And he's like, oh, through Bluetooth. Where's your threat model? What just happened? How are you doing this? And I happened to know who he was working for, and I talked to his boss, not as a like finger point thing. I was like, we need to have a conversation about how you're working through your devs and your sec and your threat modeling, because the other part is if you've seen one hospital, you've seen one hospital. So their setups rather. So you have to threat model everything every piece of equipment as an individual piece, but then you also have to threat model it within the hospital as a whole.
Great, thanks, Nina. Anyone want to follow that?
I've had a product owner just outright walk out of a session before. I don't know if anyone's had that. So I always advocate for having product owners or product managers present, because ultimately they help prioritize the things that you find. And so it's great for them to understand and see their engineers talk about it. Unfortunately, in this session, one of the engineers kind of clearly held his hand up and was like, so been in this team for like 3 years and I've been meaning to say this whole time, and then just kind of went into this huge kind of, I guess, verbal vomit of this vulnerability that they'd been aware of and been too nervous to talk about, or felt they didn't have the platform to talk about it. And the product owner just was, I think, a bit overwhelmed and a bit frustrated and a bit, I think, hurt by that quietness, and walked out. And it, on reflection, one of the things that it taught me, and one of the things I now do at the beginning of every session, is to try and remind people that it's not personal, it's not an attack. We're here to exercise a muscle rather than beat up an enemy. I think Adam covers it well in terms of a great idea of the gamification is to try and take personal opinions away from it, and the emotional investment away from it, and make it more of an object that you focus on, rather than that small child that you've been working on and feeding and nourishing for years and years. So yeah, I've definitely taken a personal lesson away to make sure that I try and make these sessions feel less emotionally invested.
That actually reminds me of a time when somebody got really angry at elevation of privilege. And they said, we're doing serious work here. We don't play games. Nobody's paying you to play a game. And so now when I start out, I always ask people to set aside their skepticism for 10 minutes. And by the time 10 minutes is up, they're engaged with the game and they've forgotten they were annoyed, and it's all working.
Great, thanks for those responses. Yeah, well, I think as an ex-developer now, I can really relate to being very attached to code that I wrote as a developer. And if you're I can imagine doing a threat modeling, you can feel very much protective of your code. Okay, let's pick another question. So Simon Gibbs's odds are some people like cheating. So do you encourage cheating in threat modeling sessions?
Yes.
Can you give us an example of what cheating would look like?
So I actually had a conversation with Agile Stationery about that, because their decks are different to the original ones that were produced by the Cornucopia project. And they're different in that they've gone with sort of the same format size as the EOP card, so they're a nice, decent sized card. But they've made a mistake, in my opinion, in that they've colored the back of the cards the same as the suit is colored, which means it's harder to cheat. In the game, you are supposed to follow suit with the same color, but if somebody's just played the king of a particular suit and you have the queen, you definitely don't want to play the queen now, because you can't win the round and you're going to waste your queen. So you want to say, no, I don't have that card, and then play something else, right? Something cheap and something that's a low value card, and you get the point, but you won't win the round, but you wouldn't have won the round anyway because the king's in play. Also, if you watch the video that I posted, you'll see that I'm actually playing this with a team, and at some point, somebody plays a card, and then they kind of lie about what the attack on the card is, discuss a real attack on the system we're describing, and the conversation becomes about that attack on the system, and we all go, yes, that attack you described, not the one that's on the card, but the one you described is a valid attack. We'll give you the point. Oh, look, you played a card that was high. They won the round too. So we uncovered a valid attack that was high value, but not the one that was described on the card. So they cheated too. But I encourage it, because hackers are not going to not cheat, right? If I'm attacking your system as a hacker, I'm going to take all the advantages I can. I'm going to make use of the fact that the systems are 16 years old or 15 years old. I'm going to abuse that. I'm going to abuse the fact that they were never designed to be online, of course. So yes, cheat all the time. it's a game.
Great. Anyone to add for that, or should we go for another question? Okay, let's pick another question. Okay, the next question from Jess Gibbs was, what's the best way to get a team started with threat modeling over and above buying a deck? Is there examples people can look at, or are there examples of completed threat models that can help people new to this concept get started?
I can start on that one. So there is an OWASP project called Threat Modeling Cookbook that a lot of people have been contributing to. That has some example models. I guess I'd kind of point back to one of the quotes in Grant Ongers' deck that there's a lot of models out there, and not all of them are. So in fact, many of them are wrong, I think, but some of them are useful. I'm going to do a terrible job of that quote, but what I'm trying to say effectively is comparison can be the thief of joy. And so when you look at some of these models, some of them may look so, I guess, complete that it can really put you off of the effort that you might want to invest. And so I would just think back to the value that you want to get from the activity that you're performing, which is to find some threats, right? When we kick it off, so when we've kicked it off here at Moonpig for the first time with a team, we've just got them to draw a diagram, and then for kind of our intro, we've just talked through a couple of things that can go wrong, and we've had the security team guide them. And then we've gone into things like cornucopia and elevation of privilege and stride and the 4 questions to kind of help. And we've noticed that for some teams, just the 4 questions is enough. They've got a good level of knowledge, and that's all they need. And then other questions, other teams really need the prompts. I have found that where teams really struggle, or where you're with a particularly non-technical team or a junior team, there's an approach that Avi Douglin talks about a lot. He's one of the co-leads for the OWASP threat modeling project, which is value-driven threat modeling. I kind of break that a little bit as well, but what he talks about is what would remove the value of what you're trying to do, and then think of vulnerabilities that would help remove the value of what it is you're trying to do. So you're trying to build a login functionality for a web page, and your engineers can't think of threats, then help them to think about, okay, what would remove the value? Okay, login breaks. Okay, well, what are all the things that could break login? They've been some approaches that have worked for me, but cheat sheets have been a massive help in that. So quick kind of PDFs that they can refer to digitally that have 4 questions, stride, the approach to value, stuff like that.
I'd also add, you can do threat modeling on things other than building software. So an example that comes to mind is this Zoom product we're using right now. In the early days of Zoom being popularized, there were lots of news reports of security vulnerabilities or risks or concerns people had about using it. And whichever side of the argument you fell on, there were fairly vocal opinions in the press about whether we should be abandoning it or what we should be doing. And frankly, some of the issues that they were talking about were trivially solved. So what we did was create a threat model for our use of Zoom, not for building it, not for developing it and designing encryption algorithms or how we're going to solve problems of multiple participants in video recording, but how are we going to use this product? And we actually wrote a blog post on it saying, these are the things that we think could go wrong if we were to use Zoom. And here are the features that Zoom provide us that we can configure to address those concerns. And that allows us to make a really balanced judgment about, is this the right product for us? Does it solve our concerns rather than everyone else's, but with a product that anyone can understand? And so to come full circle, looking at examples of systems that you already understand is really, really valuable, because a lot of examples that you might get from coworkers or friends that work in other companies, you may not understand the system well enough to really get to the guts of why that thing is a problem. So if you can find examples of software you use, or even try it yourself on something like, I'm using a mobile phone. Everyone has a mobile phone. What could go wrong with my phone? Why do I set a PIN? There's a thought process. It's a subconscious one maybe, but you've gone through a thought process that is a threat modeling exercise of, I need to set a PIN, and this is how I've made that decision. So take advantage of those before moving into something like a greenfield or brownfield software engineering program, I would suggest.
I want to follow up on the word completed here, because we can think about threat modeling as a thing to document, or we can think about it as a thing to do, right? And Stuart, you were just talking about this in terms of the maybe it's just a thought process, maybe it's a little implicit rather than a formal thing. What's important is not that we complete the work in some sense of having every I dotted and every T crossed. In the agile world, what's important is that we're engaging with the practice and that we're doing it over and over again as part of what we're doing, not that we come to some completed thing. When in my consulting work, I almost never end up with anything that looks like the last threat model, because the project I'm working on is different, the demands are different. And so Tash had a great comment. Was it comparison is the thief of joy? I love that. Yes. Think about, are you happy with doing this? Not, does it look like what someone else has done?
Great, thanks for those responses. I'm Googling now how to set a pin on my phone. I'm just joking. Right, so a question from Simon Gibbs was for Nina. Are you satisfied with the EOP, elevation of privilege or cornucopia? They've been comprehensive for the medical devices field. Is there anything you would change for them, for your field?
I would maybe put them together and add more elements of the patients, the human factors inside, because the unaccounted for is usually the patient that comes in. And you're gonna make, I got a text that somebody's gonna make me a version, which I'm totally down for. So part of the problem with the medical devices, part of the issue with the medical devices is, again, that it comes in at the last minute. And I don't necessarily believe that I'm going to do this. People don't have sandboxes in their hospitals to set all of these things up. So the hospital is the sandbox, which also creates a problem. So you understanding your assets, having a list of your assets would be great. Knowing where those things are on each floor, on which patient, et cetera, et cetera. So if you wanted to make a medical device version of this, I would be completely down to help you with this. And we can take it back into the medical field because it's mutable, right? It's still changing, and that constant evolution, they're still learning. They've taken a lot of what we do as dev and security on the outside and brought it in, but it doesn't quite fit the need for what medical is doing. Great,
thanks for that answer, Nina. Okay, so we'll take one from John Stabley. Which game would you recommend? I'll rephrase John's question. He asked about elevation of privilege or cornucopia for threat modeling. I'm just curious, what are the differences between the two of them when you're using them for threat modeling? How do they compare? What does one contribute over the other? Should you do both?
Adam, I'll let you field this one.
So actually, I'm going to literally field this one. Behind me, you can see my museum of games. Let me get out of the way. There's lots of games for different purposes. And the question for me is, which game is engaging for the people that are working there, for the project that you're working on? And I'll put a link in for a list of all of those games.
Great, thanks. Do you want to add to that, Grant?
Only to say that I have a slightly smaller version of that list of games behind Adam, so I'm going to be looking to buy stuff on Amazon this weekend. No, the right answer is that the game, it's about doing the threat modeling. Whichever game helps you get there, whichever game works for the team that you're working with, that's the one you should be using. But you should be doing threat modeling, and it shouldn't be a checkbox exercise. It should be an engaging exercise. So I believe gamification is the only way to do that, and I believe that there are lots of games out there that work.
I can see this is like a habit that making it fun, making it something that people want to do and start doing as a regular part of their development process is a real kind of strength. Yeah, let's answer another question. So from Jess Gibbs, do you recommend any particular specialist tools for diagramming during threat models, e.g. Threat Dragon, or just going back to something like Draw.io?
I'm a big, oh, sorry, I'll
Go for
let
it,
you
Dash. No, go for it.
I'm a big advocate of using the tools engineering already using. I don't want to introduce a new tool or a new process, like, I mean, apart from threat modeling, obviously. But if they have a diagramming tool of choice, which I imagine they do, especially in this new virtual world, that's the one I'm going to use. And I'm going to, if it doesn't work great for me, I'm just going to learn it and I'm going to go with the flow, because I don't want that team to have to think about a new process and security threats and a new tool at the same time.
100%. If they can build it into how they do things, that's the only way you'll get them to use it, and it's the only way that it'll actually have value to them.
Great. Okay, shall we move on to another question? We've got a few minutes left. So another question from not sure how you pronounce this person's name, but something they've had a hard time doing in their team is trying to identify skilled threat modelers within their team. Is there a way of assessing the quality, I guess, of a threat model? So perhaps another way of putting it is, how would you tell if threat modeling was done badly?
So I start with the idea of sort of a pyramid of form and content and artistry. So with form, did we answer the question, what are we working on? Do we have some sort of diagram, even if it's tiny? How are we communicating this? Do we have a list of threats? Did we play Cornucopia and write them down? Or did we scratch our heads and say, we've got, maybe at the beginning, all we're doing is, as Tash said, what would impact the value of this? And then there's the artistry. Do I think this is good? Do I look it over? But usually when someone asks the question of, is this good? They're at the form or content level. And so just having a diagram, and I said before, don't do this, now I'm going to change my answer. Compare a little bit to the things in the Cookbook project, right? Does it look vaguely like those? If not, have a conversation about, why did you do it this way? Why are you answering this question in this way? And that will get you to the question of, is this good?
Okay, can we move on to another question, because we're getting close to the end. Thanks very much for that answer, Adam. It's a question from Viv Richards. What's the scariest security thing you've ever come across? So perhaps we can have 3 different scary things that people have seen.
I'll go first after a quick skim of who's on the call, just to check I'm not going to get in trouble. I'm joking. I'm sure we're all under various NDAs, so some of them are very
probably
different.
best not to mention any specific client names.
Absolutely. I guess this is more of a generalization, but I'm going to be a bit of a pain, but things that aren't things. So I have come across a number of diagrams that were the intended diagram, the intended design, but don't reflect reality. And so that's not really a fair answer of the scariest thing I've ever seen. But the scariest thing I've ever seen was an instance of where the diagram that everyone worked from was not what was built, and everyone forgot to update the diagram. And long story short, you've got, I don't know, a completely flat network, or you've got everyone's assuming someone else is doing the authorization layer or something like that. So yeah, it's always things on diagrams that are there but not there.
Great, thanks, Tash. Who wants to follow that?
People did not account for end of life in software, and they are still working off of XP and 95.
Yes, you still see that so much, don't you? It is scary.
Don't worry, we'll just buy additional life support on it from Microsoft. Because that's actually a thing, right? Those teams are still actively, no, they're not.
I think one story I'll add, it's perhaps not quite answering the question, but I worked somewhere once where a vulnerability was discovered in the product that was built, and it was reported to the company by an outside researcher. The team then fixed the issue as it was described and released a change. And then 6 months later, it was reported again by a different researcher. And so they fixed the problem again as it was described. And then a little while later, it was reported again by the same researcher. And the reason why I think that's the scariest thing is because I think it's reasonable to expect that we will miss things. It's unreasonable to expect that we will fix the same thing 3 times. And I think it's being very cautious about identifying the bounds of how we're testing what we fix is really, really important. And we should place as much scrutiny around fixing security issues as we do around functional issues. And I don't think we always get that parity correct.
Yeah, that's a great lesson to end on. All right, we need to draw today's session to a close. Thank you everyone for the different questions, for the nice diversity of questions today. It's been a really useful session on threat modeling. I'm quite keen to try this out with the team I'm currently working with. Many thanks to Grant for his presentation today, for Grant, Tash, Nina, Adam and Stuart for sharing their expertise on the Fishbowl panel. Next week is our final in our security series. It's going to be Chris Rutter. He's a great guy I've worked with. Knows a lot about platform security. He's going to be talking about platform security in real life, busting buzzwords and building better. If you'd like to sign up for this talk, you can head over to equalexperts.com to sign up there. So thank you again for everyone that's joined us. Thank you for people that have contributed, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, folks. Bye.